The chatter and laughter from Jessica's dining room came to an abrupt halt when I stepped inside, holding the last dish, my signature maple pecan pie, still warm from the oven. 18 dishes I had lovingly prepared over the past 3 days, each one made with care and precision, despite the aching in my arthritic hands. But as I stood there, pie in hand, my heart sank. The table was set for 12, every seat occupied. And there, in that moment, I realized there was no place for me. Before we dive back in, let us know where you're tuning in from. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow, I've got something even more special lined up just for you. It was Thanksgiving, and Margaret Wilson stood in the doorway of her daughter Jessica's home, holding a maple pecan pie she had carefully made. Her hands, worn with age but steady, grasped the dish with a sense of pride. Yet, her heart sank as she looked at the scene before her. Her daughter Jessica was too busy chatting with her friends, including Emma, her new boyfriend's acquaintance, to notice her. Margaret had spent days preparing the traditional feast. The years of cooking Thanksgiving dinners had been marked by routine and joy, a sense of purpose that had filled her life after retirement. But something had shifted this year, and as she scanned the room, she realized the painful truth. She was no longer a part of the family dynamic. In a flash, the weight of invisibility hit her, the recognition that her value had diminished with age and circumstance. Her grandson Noah, who at 8 years old still had the innocence to ask the important questions, raised his voice from the table. "Why can't Grandma sit with us? She made everything." His confusion echoed through Margaret's mind, a stark reminder of the unfairness she had come to tolerate. It was a moment that shifted everything. "I think I'll head home," Margaret said, her voice surprising herself with how steady it was. Jessica barely glanced up from her conversation, trying to dismiss her mother with a feigned concern. "Mom, you can't just leave," Jessica protested, but Margaret was resolute. She took her purse, walked out, and left the family gathering behind. The walk back to her small cottage was long and cold, but each step was a little lighter than the one before. For the first time in years, Margaret wasn't just reacting, she was acting. She realized that, for too long, her identity had been shaped by others' needs. Her husband's, her daughter's, the family's. But now, for the first time in years, she was beginning to remember who she was before she became the caretaker, the helper, the unnoticed one. That evening, Margaret made herself toast with jam, sitting alone at her kitchen table. The familiar emptiness of her cottage was punctuated only by the lingering questions that gnawed at her. How had she become so disposable? She thought back to her years as a teacher, to her marriage with Daniel, to Jessica's childhood, and realized how she had allowed herself to be sidelined. She had forgotten that love and worth were not simply about service to others. The next morning, Margaret took a bold step. She visited her bank and closed the joint account she had shared with Jessica. She directed her teacher's pension into a private account, reclaiming control of her finances. Her next move was harder. Margaret took her mother's antique silver, which had been sitting in storage for years, and sold it at a local antique shop. The silver, a piece of her past, had felt like something to hold on to, a connection to her identity. But today, it was just another thing she was willing to part with in order to find herself again. By noon, there were already texts from Jessica. "The gravy is lumpy, and Ryan's mom is complaining. Can you come back and fix it?" Margaret didn't respond. She was done being everyone's solution. She called her neighbor Lauren, who had retired from law a few years ago. Together, they reviewed the deed to Margaret's cottage. Lauren's eyes widened as she noticed a troubling clause. Daniel had retained the right of first refusal on the property at a price fixed years ago, far below its current market value. "Margaret," Lauren said, "this is borderline predatory." The realization hit Margaret like a thunderclap. For years, she had accepted Daniel's version of their life together, including the divorce. But now she understood how much of her past had been rewritten, manipulated for Daniel's benefit. It wasn't just about the house. It was about everything. And now, she was finally ready to fight back. Margaret sat quietly at her kitchen table, reviewing the documents Lauren had helped her uncover, her mind racing with new revelations. She had always believed that Daniel had been the supportive husband, the one who had allowed her to keep the cottage, the one who had provided for her. But the truth, now laid bare before her, was starkly different. The man she had trusted for over 30 years had not been generous but had manipulated her, using subtle tactics to control their finances and, in turn, her life. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Jessica again, another demand disguised as concern. "Where are you, Mom? Noah's science project is due tomorrow. You need to help him with it." The casual dismissiveness, the entitlement in Jessica's message, made Margaret's stomach turn. She had spent years saying yes, meeting everyone's needs, first her husband's, then her daughter's, then her grandchildren's. The constant supply of love and service was exhausting, and yet, she had let herself be swept into it, because she thought that was what love was supposed to be. But it wasn't love. It was obligation. It was erasure. For the first time, Margaret didn't feel the need to jump at the chance to help. She took a deep breath and put down her phone. She had already spent her life trying to fulfill the roles others had given her. But now, she was Margaret Wilson. Not just a mother, a wife, a helper. She was herself, with her own rights, her own voice, her own needs. The next few days were a whirlwind of decisions, some small, some large. Margaret went to the bank again and closed out her joint account with Jessica. She had thought that sharing finances with her daughter after the divorce would be practical, but now, it felt like one more way to be controlled, to be the background figure in everyone else's story. She transferred her pension into a new account, one that only she would control. She also took a hard look at her cottage. It was a small, modest home, but it was hers. And as much as she had wanted to keep it for sentimental reasons, it was time to make it truly hers. The memories of her life with Daniel, of years spent in the home they had built together, felt increasingly like shackles. But now, she had an opportunity to redefine her life. Margaret decided it was time to sell some of her old furniture, things she had kept out of obligation rather than true need. She sold her mother's antique silver to an appraiser and used the money to build up a small emergency fund. Each act, each choice, felt like a reclamation of her power. The turning point came when she reached out to Thomas, Daniel's brother, who had always treated her with kindness. He was surprised to hear from her but promised to help. Margaret had already begun looking into the clause in her cottage deed that had given Daniel the right to buy the property at a discounted price, but it was Thomas who confirmed what she feared. Daniel had been taking advantage of her for years. It wasn't just the house. It was their whole marriage. When Jessica came to visit, her behavior was still the same. She was distracted and defensive, making excuses for her father's actions. But Margaret could see the cracks in Jessica's carefully constructed persona, the one she had so clearly inherited from her father. The realization that Jessica was absorbing Daniel's narrative without question had hurt Margaret deeply. But now, she understood that Jessica's perception was shaped not just by her father, but by years of Margaret's own silence. Margaret had allowed herself to be invisible, but no more. By the time Jessica texted again, Margaret was already on her way to the community center, where she had decided to volunteer. She had spent so many years feeling invisible, ignored, and dismissed. But here, in this small act of giving back to others, she had started to feel seen. The second chapter program she had started for women over 50 had grown into something meaningful. Women who had felt sidelined by age, by divorce, by loss, were beginning to take back control of their lives. It was a small start, but it was hers. Later that night, as Margaret sat with Noah and helped him with his science project, she saw the first glimmer of change. Noah, ever the curious child, asked why she hadn't stayed for Thanksgiving dinner, why there was no seat for her at the table, even though she had cooked the entire meal. Margaret smiled softly, resisting the urge to sugarcoat the answer. She owed him the truth. "Sometimes, people forget that others have needs too," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not going to let that happen to me anymore. I'm going to make sure there's always a seat at my table, and that includes you." Noah, with his wide-eyed innocence, nodded as if he understood. Margaret wasn't sure if he truly grasped the weight of what she was saying, but in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was teaching him something far more important than science or history. She was teaching him the value of self-respect and the importance of claiming a place in the world, just as he was. A few weeks passed since Margaret had closed her joint account with Jessica, reclaimed control over her finances, and begun a new chapter in her life. The transformation wasn't instant, but the steps she was taking, small, deliberate acts of asserting herself, were starting to make an impact. As her community program grew, Margaret began to realize that this wasn't just about her own healing. This was about helping other women rewrite their stories, too. Women who had spent decades sidelined by the expectations of their families, their communities, and even themselves. But just as Margaret felt the ground beneath her beginning to shift, a new challenge arose. One afternoon, as she sat in the garden enjoying a rare moment of peace, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Lauren, her lawyer, with a subject line that made Margaret's stomach drop. Legal threat from Daniel. Margaret, Lauren's text read, I just received a letter from Daniel's lawyer. It's a cease and desist regarding your public statements, particularly about the finances in your marriage and the Gazette article. He's threatening a lawsuit for defamation and emotional distress. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she read the words. She had anticipated Daniel's reaction, his need to control the narrative, but she hadn't expected it to escalate this quickly. He had always preferred the subtlety of manipulation, not the direct confrontation that now seemed imminent. The letter arrived the next day, delivered in a sleek envelope with the familiar firm name on the corner. Margaret sat down to read it carefully, her mind already working through her response. As expected, it was filled with threats. He wanted her to stop speaking about their marriage, to retract her statements in the Gazette, and to erase the truth she had begun to share. But the most chilling part of the letter was the implied threat. If Margaret did not comply, Daniel would go public with claims of her mental instability and financial incompetence, the very narrative he had built over the years to justify his actions. For a moment, Margaret felt the old familiar rush of fear, the impulse to retreat into silence and avoid the conflict. She had lived in that space for so long. But this time, something inside her snapped. She had already made the choice not to shrink, not to erase herself. She wasn't going to let Daniel silence her again. Margaret immediately called Lauren, who advised her to take the legal route, but she knew deep down that this was not just a legal matter. It was a continuation of the same power struggle that had dominated her marriage. Daniel was not just trying to protect his reputation. He was trying to bury her voice once and for all. Instead of caving to his demands, Margaret decided to fight back, not through aggression but through truth. She reached out to Sarah Chen, the reporter from the Gazette who had written the first article about her community program. The follow-up article would be an opportunity to make her stance clear, not just for herself, but for all the women who had been silenced, manipulated, or erased. They met at Riverside Cafe that afternoon. Sarah, eager and attentive, listened as Margaret laid out her plan. I'm not just fighting for myself, Sarah. I'm fighting for all the women who've been told their voices don't matter, Margaret said firmly. The truth is, I've spent years living under the weight of other people's narratives. But I'm done with that. My truth matters too. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, her pen poised above her notebook. I understand. This isn't just about you anymore, is it? No, Margaret replied. It's about creating space for women like me. Women who've lived under the shadow of someone else's version of their lives. This is about reclaiming that space. By the time they parted ways, the article was already taking shape. Margaret had agreed to go on record about her experiences, knowing full well that it would bring more scrutiny to her life. But it was a risk she was willing to take. That night, after her meeting with Sarah, Margaret received a text from Jessica. It was short, simple, and to the point. Dad's really upset about the article. He says you're spreading lies about him. Margaret stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. The familiar guilt crept in, but she dismissed it just as quickly. She had not lied. She had shared her truth. Rather than apologizing or trying to smooth things over, Margaret typed a response. I'm not spreading lies, Jessica. I'm sharing my truth. Your father may not like it, but that doesn't change the facts. She hit send, then placed her phone on the counter and walked out into the garden to clear her mind. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt a sense of resolve that was deeper than any fear or guilt. The next morning, the follow-up article was published. It detailed the intimidation tactics Daniel had used, the financial manipulation, and how his narrative of the marriage had been built on lies. Margaret's statement in the article emphasized that her intention wasn't to destroy him, but to reclaim her own story. The article went viral locally, and soon after, the messages began to flood in. Women who had attended Margaret's workshops reached out to offer support. Neighbors who had long been on the sidelines now voiced their admiration. A local attorney even volunteered to assist her if Daniel pursued legal action. Margaret's life, once confined to the margins, was now at the center of a larger conversation about women's autonomy and the erasure of their stories. In the midst of all this, Margaret received a call from Jessica. Her voice was tight with emotion, but there was something different about it this time. "Mom," Jessica said hesitantly, "I've been thinking about everything, about the article, about what you said." Margaret held her breath, unsure of what to expect. "I don't know if I agree with everything," Jessica continued, "but I'm starting to see things differently. I'm starting to understand why this matters to you." The conversation continued, with Jessica acknowledging how her father's narrative had shaped her understanding of their family. Margaret listened, her heart swelling with a quiet hope. It wasn't an instant reconciliation, but it was a start. A start to something new, something more truthful. Margaret sat in her kitchen with the letter in her hand, the weight of it sinking in. Daniel's threats weren't just legal, they were deeply personal, aiming to discredit her, to erase the life she had built and the truth she had reclaimed. She had spent years under his control, quietly enduring his manipulation, but now, finally speaking her truth, she was being attacked for it. She could almost hear his voice on the phone, the same way he had always belittled her, dismissing her reality. His latest move was just another attempt to control her, using the power he still believed he had over her. But Margaret wasn't the same woman who had stood in his shadow for so many years. She had finally broken free from the prison of silence and submission that Daniel had built around her. Now, she wasn't going to let him rewrite her history or force her back into the background. The letter had shaken her, but instead of retreating, Margaret was determined to face this head-on. That evening, she called Lauren Davis, her neighbor and trusted confidant. Lauren had been instrumental in helping her reclaim control over her finances and property, and Margaret knew she would help her navigate this legal threat as well. As Margaret spoke with Lauren about the letter, she felt a sense of clarity wash over her. She wouldn't be intimidated. She had fought for too long to regain her sense of self, and now, she was ready to fight for the right to speak her truth. Margaret decided that she would take the matter to court if it came to that. She wouldn't let Daniel or anyone else silence her again. Lauren, too, understood the importance of Margaret's position. "This isn't just about you anymore," Lauren said. "It's about every woman who's been erased, dismissed, or controlled. You're standing up for them too." Margaret knew that Lauren was right. It wasn't just her own story she was reclaiming. It was the collective story of women who had been silenced, ignored, and made to feel invisible. The next day, Margaret met with Sarah Chen from the Oakage Gazette, who had written the original article about her second chapter program. Margaret wasn't going to back down. She showed Sarah the legal letter and explained the situation. Sarah, ever the professional, agreed to write a follow-up article, this time focusing not just on Margaret's program, but also on the broader issue of how women's voices were silenced and erased by their families, society, and even the legal system. For Margaret, the act of telling her story was liberating. Each word she spoke, each document she shared, was a victory in itself. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She was demanding space to exist on her own terms. But even as she fought for her voice, the emotional toll of it all was undeniable. The legal threats, the personal attacks, and the emotional manipulation from Daniel weighed heavily on her. The fear of what could happen next was ever present, and she struggled with moments of doubt. She had worked so hard to regain her sense of self, but now, standing up to Daniel's well-oiled machine, she feared the price might be too high. The follow-up article ran in the Gazette, and to Margaret's surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Women in the community, many of whom had attended her workshops, rallied behind her. They understood what she was going through, and they were ready to support her. Some reached out with messages of encouragement, while others offered legal advice or pro bono assistance. For the first time in years, Margaret felt supported, not alone. Despite this wave of support, Daniel remained unmoved. He was furious, but Margaret knew that the more he fought, the more people would see him for what he truly was. A man who had spent years controlling and manipulating his wife, and now, trying to do the same to his ex-wife. Margaret had always been the one to put everyone else's needs before her own. But now, she was beginning to see that her needs mattered too. Her voice mattered. Her truth mattered. As the weeks passed, Daniel's legal team backed down. It seemed that the community's support for Margaret was more than Daniel could handle. No matter how much he tried to control the narrative, Margaret was finally taking ownership of her story. But the battle wasn't over. There were still personal consequences to navigate. Jessica, caught between her father's influence and her growing understanding of her mother's perspective, was struggling. But Margaret felt hope. Her daughter was starting to see things differently, and though the journey to reconciliation would take time, Margaret was no longer willing to remain silent or invisible in her own life. At her community center workshop, the women in the group began to share their own stories of reclaiming their voices, and Margaret realized that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every woman who had been made to feel small, insignificant, or erased. Though Daniel was still trying to control the narrative, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. No matter the legal battles, no matter the tension with her daughter, she had reclaimed her voice. And in doing so, she had discovered that the woman she had been all along, strong, capable, and worthy, had always been there. Now Margaret would continue to move forward, one small step at a time, knowing that her seat at the table was rightfully hers. Ask ChatGPT. The summer after the community garden party arrived with a quiet sense of triumph. The weight of the past seemed lighter, like a book whose pages had finally been turned, revealing a new chapter of Margaret's life. As the days grew warmer, she watched her garden flourish, the fruits of her labor, much like her own journey, beginning to show the results of steady care. Margaret's workshops at the community center were thriving. Every session was filled with women of all ages, backgrounds, and experiences, all seeking the same thing: a chance to speak their truth, reclaim their stories, and stand in their own power. Margaret had created a space for these women, but in doing so, she had also created a space for herself. Each week, as she listened to their stories and shared her own, she was healing, too. Jessica had started attending the workshops, not as a participant at first, but as an observer. Margaret hadn't pushed her to join. She understood the process of discovery took time, especially when it came to untangling years of ingrained beliefs. But one evening, as Margaret stood at the front of the room, sharing her story and offering encouragement, she saw Jessica in the back, quietly taking it all in. That was all she needed to know. The changes in her daughter were subtle but undeniable. Jessica had started questioning her own life choices, the path she had followed for so long, and most importantly, she was beginning to see her mother in a new light. Margaret no longer saw the cold, defensive version of her daughter who once accepted her father's version of their past. She was starting to see a woman capable of independent thought, empathy, and understanding. And then there was Noah. Margaret had become more involved in her grandchildren's lives, especially Noah, who now visited her regularly. They spent hours together in the garden, picking vegetables, baking cookies, and learning about the world around them. It wasn't just about providing childcare anymore. It was about building a relationship based on mutual respect, love, and shared experiences. It wasn't perfect. Jessica still struggled with her loyalty to her father, and there were moments when the old patterns of guilt and confusion threatened to resurface. But Margaret knew that those were just remnants of the past, echoes of a time when she had been invisible in her own life. One Saturday afternoon, as Margaret sat on the porch of her cottage, enjoying the quiet of the garden, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah Chan, the journalist from the Gazette who had covered her story. "I just wanted to thank you again," Sarah's message read. Your story is helping so many women. It's creating a shift in the way people view older women and their voices. You're making history, Margaret. Margaret smiled, a warm feeling of satisfaction spreading through her. She had never imagined that something as simple as telling the truth could have such far-reaching effects. But here she was, not just rebuilding her life, but becoming a beacon for others who had felt unseen and unheard. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a call from Lauren. "How's everything going?" Lauren asked. "The program's growing, I assume?" "It is," Margaret replied. "We've even started a second group for women in their 50s and 60s, who've spent most of their lives focusing on others and are now rediscovering themselves." "It's amazing." Lauren was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Margaret, I just want you to know that you're an inspiration. You've shown so many of us that it's never too late to reclaim our lives, to make our voices heard." Margaret paused, taking in Lauren's words. She felt a swell of gratitude, both for the people in her life and for the strength that had carried her through all of this. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm finally beginning to believe that." Later that evening, Margaret sat down with Jessica at the kitchen table, their teacups steaming between them. It had been a week since the garden party, and their relationship had continued to evolve in small, meaningful ways. Jessica looked up from her tea, her eyes thoughtful. "Mom," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about purpose versus advancement. You're right, I've been so focused on climbing this corporate ladder, trying to make my dad proud, that I haven't stopped to think about what I really want." Margaret smiled gently, proud of her daughter for her self-awareness. "It's not about rejecting what you've done, Jessica. It's about understanding that you deserve to live a life that's true to you, not to anyone else's expectations." "I know," Jessica said quietly, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "I think I'm starting to understand that. I've been following a path that wasn't really mine. It's hard to admit, but I'm realizing that I don't have to keep following it just because it's familiar." "That's the first step," Margaret said, her heart swelling with pride. "And remember, it's never too late to change course. No matter where you are in your life, there's always room for growth." Their conversation was quiet, meaningful, the kind of conversation that was once too difficult to have but now felt like a natural part of their evolving relationship. The following day, Margaret visited the community center to check on the second chapter program. She was greeted by the usual buzz of activity, the women chatting and laughing together, sharing stories of triumphs and struggles. It was exactly as she had hoped, a place where women could come to heal, to reclaim their power, and to realize that they were not alone. As Margaret walked through the room, she overheard one of the women telling another, "You know, Margaret really opened my eyes. She's shown us that it's never too late to start over, to find our own voice." Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent so many years being told who she was, how she should act, what her life should look like. But now, she was finally being recognized for the woman she had always been beneath it all. Strong, resilient, capable of creating change not just in her own life but in the lives of others. And as she stood there, in the midst of the women whose lives had been touched by her courage, Margaret realized that the true beauty of her journey was not just in the reclaiming of her story, but in the way she had helped others reclaim theirs. When she returned home, Margaret walked through her garden, her hand brushing against the tall flowers she had nurtured with love and care. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years, as if the seeds of her own transformation had finally taken root. For the first time in a long while, Margaret knew that no matter what came next, she was ready to face it. She had found her place at the table, and no one, not even Daniel, could take it away from her. The future, once uncertain and clouded by fear, now felt wide open with possibility. And with each passing day, Margaret was more and more certain of one thing: she was exactly where she was meant to be.